Hi, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. I want to welcome you today to the ECPN Conservation in a Changing World. We are so excited about today's panel, and we hope to have a very lively discussion. Before we get started, I wanted to remind you of some of the tools that will help you engage with us today. Automatic captions are available for this and all conference sessions. To enable the captions, click on the CC link on the bottom of your toolbar. On the toolbar, you'll also find access to your chat feature. Please note that you can choose to post your chat to just the panelists or to panelists and attendees using the drop-down menu. While the chat is for more casual discourse and letting us know where you're tuning in from or just saying hello, if you have questions for the panelists, please post them in a separate Q&A box also found on the toolbar of your screen. This will help me keep track of the questions, and we're going to address those questions in the second half of our discussion. This session is being recorded and will be available on the website following the session. So let's get started. Myself, along with all of the panelists here today, would like to acknowledge that we are speaking to you from the unceded territories and homelands of so many Native people. We respectfully acknowledge these Native and Indigenous people, their elders, past and present, and honor with gratitude the land itself and those who have stewarded it throughout the generations. Please download the associated materials, which includes our full land acknowledgements, bios for the panelists, and additional materials. Now I'd like to introduce our panelists, and then I'll turn it over to each of them for a brief introduction before we jump into the discussion. I am Jessica Abel. I'm a project conservator at the Penn Museum, and I will be your moderator today. For our emerging professionals, today we have Joy Bloser, who is the assistant conservator at the Menil Collection, and Chris Canosin, who is a current student at Woodpack. And for our established conservators, we have Sanchita Balachandran, who is the associate director of the Johns Hopkins Archaeological Museum, Anisha Gupta, an incoming PhD student at the University of Delaware, and Glenn Wharton, the professor of art history at UCLA and chair of the UCLA Getty Conservation Program. I'm now going to turn it over to each of our panelists, and they're going to give you a brief introduction to themselves and their work. Joy, let's start with you.
Thanks, Jess. As Jess noted, I'm a newly joined the Menil Collection in Houston as the assistant objects conservator. And I work on a variety of objects in the collection, and I get to focus on modern contemporary materials, which is my personal passion. I'm also a Chinese translator, and income from translation work has been crucial to keeping me afloat through the financial hardships of pursuing a career as a conservator. A little background on how I got here. I didn't learn about conservation until my late 20s and was working abroad at a museum. I was quickly obsessed with conservation and moved home in 2011 to Colorado to pursue it. I took chemistry classes, translated, worked at a picture frame shop, and did contract work at art fairs between semesters to pay for the coursework and all my bills. None of the museum conservation labs in Denver agreed to let me intern or volunteer, so I widened my net and contacted Bev Perkins in Cody, Wyoming, and she apologized she didn't have any funding, but said if I wanted to come volunteer to get my foot in the door, I could. So I borrowed my sister's car and I drove to Cody, Wyoming, and I camped for 4 weeks in the Shoshone National Forest and worked in her lab as a volunteer. Bev helped me reach out to museums in Denver and get my foot in the door and told me about the grad schools and that I was probably an NYU type of candidate. By the end of the summer, she'd helped me get a spot as a conservation volunteer at the Denver Art Museum and at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. So I moved to Denver, volunteered 3 days a week, worked translating and picture framing, and finished my chemistry classes. I only applied to NYU my first year because I wanted to focus on contemporary art, and I didn't have the right kind of pre-program hours for the other schools. I got an interview, but didn't get in. And then I turned 31 and I thought my life was over, which it wasn't. And I took another contract job at an art fair. Then I promised myself I'd try just one more time. So I moved to Philadelphia and got a chemistry internship in a polymer lab and a summer gig rehousing a ceramics collection. I applied to Buffalo, Delaware, and NYU and was rejected from Delaware because I needed more science, waitlisted at Buffalo because I needed more conservation, and thankfully got into NYU. So I moved to Brooklyn in the fall of 2014 on a bank loan and the little savings I had left. And NYU offered a stipend of $20,000 for 9 months, dispersed in September and January, with a $500 increase per year. I took out additional school loans to afford New York cost of living and pushed hard on the school to revamp financial policies and transparency during my time there. After I graduated, I stayed in New York for a fellowship at MoMA, then took a non-treatment contract job in Boston with a moving stipend, so I could finally move in with my boyfriend after being long distance for many years. I moved to Houston this past February, and the Manil covered my moving expenses, and I still take on translation work, which helped me pay off debt from grad school and what I now use to build back savings and invest in retirement. It's funny to look back, and I think I entered the field of conservation 10 years ago, and I've moved 12 times. It's been a long, circuitous road, but I'm happy I'm here. And this is all to say that we have some serious financial problems in our field that can and will improve. But in the meantime, I think my advice would be to persevere, to develop a side hustle for money that you can rely on, and to build a relationship with a sponsor in the field, like Bev was for me, who can help you bang down doors. And as a final word, I would say that we all need to be negotiating for higher pay every single time we offer or are offered a job, internship, contract, or stipend. So you can do it, we just have to ask. That's it.
Thanks so much, Joy. Chris?
I want to second everything Joy just said. Those are great sentiments. Thank you. That's a great way to start off. I want to say thank you all for joining us today, and I'm incredibly grateful to be part of this amazing panel. I've looked up to all of you. So I'm a second-year graduate student at Winterthur University of Delaware program in Art Conservation, or WUDPAC. I specialize in textiles with a focus in modern and contemporary art and materials. I was born in a small, conservative, white rural town in West Michigan, and I am the first and only person in my family to go to graduate school or to graduate from college in general. My family is working class. I spent 4 years between undergrad and getting accepted into WUDPAC, trying to get into grad school. I had multiple internships, some paid, some unpaid. At one point, I was working 4 jobs at a single time, with only one offering a steady paycheck. At the time, I thought this made me a better candidate. It proved to what lengths I was willing to get into school. Now I realize how fundamentally harmful this thought process is. What if I had an emergency? I didn't have savings. I was essentially gambling with my life. I am privileged that I could put myself in a position to make that gamble. Many can't. Many have bills, debt, family to support, and other obstacles. During those 4 years, I moved 5 times to 4 different states. I didn't own a mattress, and at times I didn't own a car. With even so few possessions, I averaged that each move cost approximately $1,000. In 4 years, I dropped at least $5,000 to relocate for internships. In addition to the financial cost of those 4 years, there's a mental health cost. The instability and isolation of these temporary internships took an incredible toll on me. None of this is meant to make you pity me. It's meant to demonstrate why I might not care so much about professional standards or a perceived necessity to create a hierarchical path into the conservation field via gatekeeping education through graduate schools. I don't have the answer as to how to fix the pathway to conservation, but the system we have isn't working, and it is keeping people out of conservation. It's actively harming people who do make it through. Why can't technicians be conservators? Why can't we learn apprentice style? Much of the bench work done in conservation is done by underpaid or unpaid interns anyway. We all know that. How many of these decisions are based on social constructs of what we perceive to be professionalism, on us getting stuck on believing that this is the way to make conservation more credible? What is stopping us from evolving to have a broader definition of what a conservator is? And how much is based in a fear of change? Why are we letting it stop us? That's it.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris and Joy, both of you. I'm now going to turn it over to our more established conservators. And Sanchita, let's start with you.
Everyone, my script is in the link if that would be easier for someone. And I'm old school, I have to read it off paper. So first of all, I have to say this AIC has been like a complete sea change. It is absolutely inspiring to feel like things are happening. And that I think is very much due to this, emerging group of leaders. So I'm really grateful that it's happening. So I'm Sanchita Balachandran. I'm currently the Associate Director and Conservator at the Johns Hopkins Archaeological Museum in Baltimore, Maryland, where I've worked since 2010. I'm responsible for the care and use of the museum's collection, have a research and publishing role, and teach undergraduate courses in technical research, museum practice, and conservation ethics. I'm founder director of Untold Stories, a nonprofit organization that seeks to center the voices of BIPOC and other underrepresented voices in cultural heritage preservation. And I'm also a graduate student in the Preservation Studies PhD at the University of Delaware, working on how interdisciplinary tools from conservation may help us find evidence of the migrants, immigrants, women, enslaved people, and children who made pots in Athens between the 6th and 4th centuries BCE. So even though I've had my job now for over a decade, I was a pre-program student back in the mid-1990s. I went to college secretly in love with art history, but declared myself pre-med. My first year, I was lucky to get what is now called a Getty Merrow undergraduate internship to do paid work at a college art gallery. And that is also how I found out about conservation, which changed the course of my life. The next summer, I volunteered part-time in the conservation department at the UCLA Fowler Museum, and I continued volunteering during winter breaks, something I could do because I could stay with my parents and take the bus to the museum. By my senior year, I knew I wanted to apply to conservation grad school, and I only applied to the NYU Conservation Center because I genuinely wanted a graduate degree in art history, wanted to live in New York City, and because I thought it was the only school that would consider me given the limited amount of pre-program experience I had. If I didn't get in on my first try, I planned to pursue a fully funded PhD program in art history at UCLA. I got in, so I went, even though there was no stipend support my first semester in residence, and I had to borrow money to live. Even with funding, my annual stipend was about $18,000 a year in New York City. During my 4 grad school years, I traveled every summer for fieldwork or internships. Over the next 9 years, I moved 7 times to keep working, 3 times for graduate internships or fellowships, the rest for a combination of private practice, fieldwork, and short-term contracts. Except for a couple of decently paid years working on federal contracts, my average salary in all those years was in the mid-20,000s, which was deeply demoralizing. I love my work, but it was hard to be barely scraping by after all these years of education. I was 9 years out of graduate school by the time I got my first permanent job, the one I have now, and felt like I could stop worrying about money all the time. In the middle of all these changes, I got married, had 2 children, and started 2 different PhD programs. I tell you these things to reassure you that there's no single or direct path to what feels like a real career. You also have to be willing to look outside what our field calls success and adjust who you thought you wanted to be. When I finished graduate school in 2001, the job that I thought I wanted was a hands-on treatment-focused job at a major metropolitan museum. Now I have a job that is minimal treatment and mostly teaching and research at a small university museum. And honestly, I couldn't have imagined something I enjoy more. If I've learned anything, it's that finding your way requires sheer luck, good work, hard work, self-belief, and flexibility in equal measure. Thanks and good luck.
Thanks, Sanchita. Anisha?
Hi, everyone. I'm Anisha Gupta, and I'm a paper and preventive conservator. I feel very honored to be called an established conservator. I think if there's a word between emerging and established, maybe that's where I mentally feel like I am. But I got my master's degree at the Winter University of Delaware program. And after I graduated in 2016, I did a fellowship at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. And then I was an assistant paper conservator at the American Philosophical Society Library and Museum until just last month. I have decided to go back to school and get a PhD at the University of Delaware in the same program with Sanchita, and I'll be starting there this fall. So like what other people are saying, my pre-program journey also felt pretty rocky. My parents financially supported me through college, but they didn't support the idea of me becoming a conservator. They knew the salaries are low, and I think particularly as immigrants, they were very scared for my financial future. I was pretty determined though, so I actually pursued conservation in college, but kept it a secret for them. They thought I was majoring just in chemistry, but I was also majoring in art history and taking studio art classes. They didn't find out I was an art history major until they got the convocation invitation. I didn't know the invitations went out so early in the year, and that's how they learned about it. But they still didn't know about conservation at the time. So I know a lot of conservators rely on family support. So I'm bringing this up just because it's not everyone's story. It was a really difficult time in my relationship with my parents, not being able to share this with them. And it still kind of continues to be something that they're not as supportive of this many years later. I did do unpaid part-time internships in college alongside paid jobs, including one in a conservation lab. And because I lived in a small, affordable college town, I was able to support myself through this process. I was in the Midwest and I felt pretty isolated from the conservation field, which felt like it was really happening more on the coasts and in the big cities. So I was really grateful ECPN was new at the time, but it existed and it made me feel connected to other conservators. I felt just like I had this idea of a job that no one on my campus really knew about. So I felt like I was just kind of floating on my own. My goal since the beginning was just to get a permanent job as a conservator at some institution. I almost didn't dare to dream what that would look like. I thought I might want to be at a big fine art museum, but I knew how hard that would be. And when I started conservation, I decided that I would be willing to live anywhere and do anything to get a permanent job, which, as Chris has said, is really not a healthy attitude. You do not put yourself first in any situation like that. And I learned over the years how to center my own needs. I did get a permanent job as a conservator right after my fellowship, which was really incredible. But once I got there, I realized that it wasn't actually fulfilling for me. So what brought me into conservation was access. I loved museum collections. I wanted to access them, and I became a conservator to provide access to everyone else. But I felt like that wasn't actually my role as a conservator. I was supposed to be a gatekeeper, and I struggled with that since I've started. So I began to think critically about the role that objects that I was conserving played within their communities of origin and how these roles might be subverted by our Western collections care practice. So that's what led me to pursue a PhD to better understand the relationships connecting objects, their creators, and their caretakers. My research really aims to bring community-based practice into collections care methods. And I will say, especially in this discussion, I do not think you need to get a PhD to do any of this. I just didn't think I could do that at the institutions that I had been in. And honestly, getting a PhD was kind of an out for me in a way to feel like I could have some individual like takeover of the kind of research and work that I really wanted to be doing. And I'm very grateful at how funded the PhD program is when you're a full-time student, at least, so I can make this work. Another part of my work is workplace advocacy. As we're talking about, I want conservators, especially emerging conservators, to recognize their value and advocate for themselves, starting with salary negotiation, which can totally be the hardest part and one of the scariest things you can do. So I'm really excited to be on this panel today to talk more about that. So thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Anisha. And Glenn.
Hi, everyone. Is there a word for post-established? Does one accrue patina through the course of their career? I don't know how to position myself here, but I'll go ahead and tell you about my career. I'll begin with the beginning, but I'll also tell you about how I've reinvented myself many times over the last 40 years. I've worked in many different capacities, but in the beginning, I have a story that will now sound very familiar. After a one-year unpaid pre-program internship, I entered the Cooperstown graduate program that's now Buffalo. I graduated in 1981 and spent 5 years working on fellowships while paying off a student loan. My final fellowships were at LACMA and the Getty Conservation Institute. At age 32, I was desperate to start my career and dedicated to staying in Southern California because my husband and our 2 children lived in Santa Barbara. With no museum jobs, I established a private practice in objects conservation. During the following years, we built the business to 5 staff members. I spent every summer, most summers during those years, working on archaeological sites in Turkey and Cyprus. In 1996, I was faced with executing a conservation treatment requested by the state of Hawaii in the face of community resistance. It seemed only logical to me that the community should be involved in deciding how to care for their monument, but the state resisted. Without the tools for community engagement, ethnography, or even a model for community or indigenous conservation, I closed my private practice to pursue a PhD at age 45 at the Institute of Archaeology, University College London. I eventually gained state permission to conduct the community-based project in Hawaii and used it as a case study for my research. I received my PhD, wrote my book, moved to New York to teach part-time at NYU in the Conservation Center and the Museum Studies program. In 2007, I was hired by MoMA to launch their time-based media conservation program, and I continued teaching in the Museum Studies program 1 day per week. In 2013, I left MoMA to assume a full-time position in the Museum Studies program at NYU and continue researching and writing about contemporary art conservation. And finally, in 2019, after 20 years in New York, my husband and I moved back to California, and I assumed my current position. At UCLA Getty, we're working on many initiatives to promote sustainability, collaborative conservation, and equity and inclusion. The same is happening in all the NAGPIC programs. I'm pleased to say that we'll soon change our name to remove the problematic term ethnographic from the name of our program. We're abolishing the GRE requirement and altering the requirement for pre-program internships. And I'll be happy to speak about any of these efforts or about struggling to develop a career, running a private practice, life after PhD, systemic racism, or anything else the audience is interested in. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel.
Great, thank you so much, Glenn, and thank you so much to all the panelists. Just so everyone knows, I told them 3 minutes to introduce themselves, and I think hopefully you're monitoring the chat, but I think that was a familiar but very inspiring 3 minutes with all of you. So I'm really excited to delve into some of these questions. I think, we've covered some of the topics here, and I'm hoping that, we can just start to explore some of the nuances a little bit more. So the first thing we're going to start with this afternoon is really, talking about the career trajectory of a conservator. And I think a lot of you mentioned that. And so I've gone ahead and prepared some questions with a little bit of background information for our audience and for you all as well. And I'd like to hear from all of you and, feel free to jump in whenever. So let's see, I'd like to start this conversation by talking about the typical structure of a conservation career, from pre-program internships to graduate school internships, fellowships, sometimes several of them, short-term contract positions, and finally, the hope of one day securing a full-time position. All of these steps in a career can require relocation and often come with financial hardships and insecurity due to low wages. In 2018, ECPN conducted its own compensation survey, in which it found that the majority of graduate and postgraduate respondents, 62% and 60% respectively, reported that they were required to move for a position, while 28% of pre-programmers responded the same. Only 3% of pre-programmers, 21% of graduates, and 19% of postgraduates were provided financial support for relocation. Joy and Chris, you both spoke a bit about this, but I would really like to hear more details, if you can, about your recent experiences navigating the financial hardships surrounding the impermanence of these pre-program internships, graduate school, the internships, the fellowships, the short-term project positions. And then, open it up to the rest of the panel.
Do you want to start, Chris? I think the challenge is, I think the hardest part about it was that I had a great amount of savings when I started this journey, and that I burned through it to do all the pre-program to kind of give yourself up for it. So then by the time I got to grad school, I was essentially broke. So when you get in there, then there was a reliance on either, I was the only person in my class who had a credit card, because I was the only one who had credit. So it was interesting that I was also extending credit to my classmates who, when we needed to go, to pre-buy things and get reimbursed. And so there was this entire reimbursement thing that was costing me a lot of money because it was on my credit card. And so it was interesting that it was a benefit for me coming in as an older conservator at 31, being the oldest in the school. But also kind of, it was such a detriment for younger students coming in. And I found that to be a really big hindrance with my classmates coming through. And then as we kind of moved through the programs, there was money for certain things, and there's a way to get money if you can kind of navigate through it. There are places to find money to move or to get a new program. And we were lucky at NYU, they were really pushing paid summer internships. So they were making sure we weren't accepting unpaid summer internships at that point at school, which I really appreciate. And then coming out of that after moving every summer, and I think we talk about, I moved 12 times, but that doesn't count. I also moved back to my apartment. So I moved to DC for an internship, then I had to move back. And it costs a lot of money both ways if you're gonna bring anything at all, really, or getting there. So when I really did count how many times I actually moved, I think I moved 19 times. So, but I kept my apartment in New York and I sublet it or I Airbnb it before it got really illegal, so it's kind of this like funny thing of like where you could get money from. And my classmates always joked to me that I was always on a side hustle, but it was just wanting to keep good credit. And I actually had to repair my credit after I got out of grad school because like it dropped so low because you have your undergrad loans and I took out graduate school loans. So it's kind of was this interesting thing of like me wanting to be fiscally responsible, financially wanting to build up my, like ability to be a human, self-sustaining, and still navigate all of the different positions. But I've been really lucky. The Manila collection covered my moving expenses. MFA Boston was a contract position and I had a moving stipend for that as well. So I feel like that hopefully is moving towards a better direction for after fellowships. I don't know, Chris, if you want to speak to more of the other in-betweens.
Yeah, I've never been paid to move. That would be nice. So I guess I can speak to the stipend experience at WoodPack. We make $21.50 the first year, $22.50 the second year, and $25.50 the third year when you have a third year placement. And it's a 9-month stipend. So the expectation is that you will find funding for your summer. And I've never met anyone who didn't find funding. Debbie helps you a lot. The program helps you. That being said, in the state of Delaware, I still qualify for food stamps. I still live under the poverty line. I'm making more money now than I ever have in my entire life. So that's saying something. And I don't have savings. I don't even want to look at my credit. I mean, I get an apartment, so that feels like I'm doing something. I don't know, I feel like I'm being very negative. My advice for people is to recognize that you are human and conservation can take a long time to get into, and that's okay. Like you're not a failure if you choose any way. None of that is a failure. Taking a long time, taking a short time, deciding that it's not for you, none of that is a failure. All of this is an incredible learning experience. And even though, we're talking about these hardships, we're like building a support for you. We've all been through that. You can come talk to us. So.
Because I really appreciate that, though I don't know that I want to agree with you that running your credit into the ground is okay. But I very much appreciate both of your perspectives. And I'm happy to hear from everybody else about how they've gotten through it and what that other side is like. Yeah, Sanchita.
So I might want to have to do a quick correction because I had the $18,000 a year as a grad student number, but that included like anything I earned outside of the 9 months that I got a stipend. So I usually got paid in the summer, just to like clarify. I mean, it's still terrible, right? It's absolutely terrible, but that is actually, anyway, doesn't matter. One of the things I want to say is part of the reason why I think a lot of people don't have these requisite hours to apply to grad school is, when they're in positions like mine, where I could not afford to not work as an undergrad. And so when I did part-time volunteering, that meant that the rest of the time I was doing some kind of job in order to get paid because it was absolutely necessary for me. And that automatically just makes it hard for a lot of people to even consider this track. And I have to say, you know, just thinking about the position that I'm in now, I don't take on anybody if I'm not paying them for their time. Absolutely not. And you should just not kind of perpetuate this volunteerism. I mean, volunteerism can be great, but I think especially when this kind of power dynamic exists, it should not be something that you then force on people who are already really struggling to make it. So this, I think, really needs to change. I'm also thinking, I mean, I know a lot of graduate students now, I work with a lot of them. I mean, the average graduate student stipend here in Baltimore, which is the cost of living is much lower than some of these major metropolitan centers, is $34,000 a year. So that's for a PhD, one could argue, but I mean, this is the kind of benchmark, right? Like the very basic thing, $34,000 a year plus health benefits. And I feel like that is much more of a livable wage. So these are just the kinds of things that I'm thinking about. Like, we need to think about what actually makes this kind of graduate school time in particular livable, so that people can actually focus on their work instead of worrying about their health insurance, not having food to, I mean, I lived on a bagel diet for 3 years. What does that do to your insides, right? So we just need to really rethink what we consider support as an environment.
Yeah, I think that those are really great points. Does anybody else want to chime in? Okay, well, then we'll keep going. And we'll, along the same path, I think looking at this in the wake of COVID, there were many emerging professionals who lost internship opportunities, they lost funding for fellowships, they lost contract renewals or were furloughed in the field. And those who were lucky enough to keep their positions are struggling with the drawn out process of eventually securing a full-time position and gaining a bit of stability in life, as you were just talking about, Sanjita. So in that same 2018 compensation survey, we found that ECPs are asked to relocate for termed or contract positions. The survey found that of the 383 respondents, 48.5 reported that their position was term limited. And when asked if they knew whether or not their position could be extended, only 33 of those respondents were confident of this possibility, and 62 said that they were uncertain, and 64 just didn't even respond. So Glenn, I'm going to start with you this time, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this new data. Do you have a sense from your students that this is a significant issue in the field for those who are just starting out? Do you have any advice for ECPs about how to navigate the expectations around fellowships and short-term contracts? I've heard from ECPs that in some instances in large established institutions, fellowships are no longer counting towards years of experience, and it's making it harder to secure a permanent or a full-time position, or most importantly, maybe to negotiate for these higher salaries that we're talking about. I think many ECPs right now are worried that the new expectation in the field is that you take on more and more fellowships and then contract work, meaning that the cycle of relocation and low paying work continues for many years, maybe longer than it used to, maybe not. But any advice or thoughts that you have for recent graduates stuck in this cycle, I think would be greatly appreciated.
Oh boy, there's so many ways I could answer this, and I don't want to dominate over the next 30 minutes providing different ways to answer, but so I'll just say a few things. Yes, from my position now at the UCLA Getty program and just being in contact with other ANAGPIC students, I can say that there's a lot of anxiety right now about everything from trying to learn conservation through Zoom to in-person internships being available this summer and next year, what the job situation is going to be like in the post-pandemic world. And this coupled with the knowledge that they're entering a profession with low salaries and systemic bias. But one thing I would like to say is that I've seen this throughout my time in the profession. There are ups and downs in the economy, There was a problem in the late 1990s with the rise of museum education. A lot of conservation programs were then shut down in museums. And then, of course, in the recession around 1910, a lot of people lost their jobs and there were very few jobs. The economy then changes, comes back, or has in my career. So there's a fluctuation in the economy that we can't really control, and that we have to just deal with on a personal and institutional basis. But I also see cultural change within institutions, and I'm really heartened to see the growing resistance in our field among young conservators and others to resist this and to really push for structural changes in the field. We're doing what we can within the UCLA Getty program. I could talk more about that. But I think you asked for advice. I've reinvented myself many times for my own personal reasons. And I think we all need to be really nimble in our career and look for opportunities. And, maybe I'll just say a little bit about what people look for when they're hiring or accepting students into graduate school. So I'm not sure everyone has a good sense of that. Often many really well and overqualified people apply for positions or apply for graduate school in our field. And so the review committees are really looking for more than just checking off all the boxes. They're looking holistically at the people who are applying. So we go deep into CVs, looking for trying to read between the lines and letter of references. Is this person motivated? Do they share our values? Do they have leadership potential? Do they have a track record of working to advance the profession? Or in our case, in our program, is there evidence of fighting for social justice, collaborative practice, and sustainability? Because those are the stated values of our program. And I also just have to say, networking, it's inevitable in a small field like ours that people are going to be looking for people who know other people and evidence of, are they saying they're good? And this is really unfair to people who don't have access, and we need to fight this in every way that we can. I'm happy to see that a lot of funding agencies are now realizing this and providing funds to give access to people who haven't had it in the past. But I do believe that having human connections, making human connections is just a really important way to advance in our field. So I could, like I said, I could answer this in many other ways, but I don't want to dominate. So maybe I'll just leave it at that for now.
Great. No, thank you. I think that, those are some really good suggestions for people and interesting issues that you brought up about access and knowing people and networking. If no one else has anything to say, then I'd like to move on to education.
Can I add something, Jess, really quick?
Yeah, please.
Glenn talked about like reinventing himself. And I guess I just wanted to bring up this idea of not losing yourself as you become a conservator. I think, we all come into this profession because we have a deep passion for some aspect of the work we do. And perhaps that's doing bench treatment all the time, but I imagine there's intersections of other interests you have that come into this. Like Joy was talking about being a translator, which is kind of, a unique point. I was interested in like access, and I found a home with museum educators who are doing the work I want to do, but I just want to be a conservator doing that work. I would say in a pandemic economy that is so turbulent, thinking of what your passions are in this and finding opportunities to spin your skills to do different things. I mean, it's horrible to say you do all of this work and then you can't do the thing that you want to do. I completely recognize that. But in this sort of crisis moment that we're in, I think you don't being a successful conservator does not mean sitting at a bench and doing treatment. And hopefully that's illustrated by all of the things that this whole panel has done. And so, yeah, Nyla's saying transferable skills. It's exactly the words I'm looking for. But, you know, I do think there's a level of innovation that our field hasn't really broached as much. You know, we certainly have a lot of entrepreneurship in our field, but we can be really innovative in the kinds of positions we're even creating for ourselves. And I think there's kind of a whole new world in that, as long as we say to be a conservator, you don't need to sit there with an in-painting brush or whatever. So I just wanted to bring that up too.
No, I think that that's really great. And I think, you know, I mean, that's sort of some of what we were getting at during the opening session about opening up what the definition of a conservator really is. And I think that that's definitely important and helpful information. And Nyla, absolutely true that, you know, we have so many skills as conservators. There are other things that we can be doing and other ways that we can think about our work and our position. So I think that that's a great piece of advice. Joy, I don't want to call you out, but you did mention unions in the chat. Do you want to talk a little bit, just for a minute, about your experience with the union at MFA and how that was able to help?
Sure, I was, it's kind of two things. I was at MoMA as well, and MoMA unionized quite a while ago. And so it's interesting because it's the MoMA's, I might get the names, the types of groups wrong, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but the MoMA union, or the union that MoMA organized with, is helping other museums to organize as well. So when I was at MFA Boston, that same union chapter was helping MFA Boston unionize off of the experience that they've had at MoMA. So it was interesting to be in a place that had already negotiated and already had a union rep. And I wasn't part of that because fellows are not allowed to be in the union at MoMA. But that's different based on different museums it can be negotiated different depending on the museums you're at. So, but because MoMA had done such a good job of advocating for higher pay, I was in one of the higher paying fellowships for objects conservation. And I think it was because the museum had already unionized and had already negotiated these contracts higher. So going to MFA Boston, where a majority of the conservators are all contract based, even ones who've been there for 10, 15 years. So contracts getting renewed annually. They're unionizing while I was there, which was really interesting. And to see everyone kind of come together to understand that this was unstable and working to unionize so that they can negotiate actual proper permanent jobs, because the jobs are permanent. They've been there for 10, 15 years. They're not contract jobs. So it kind of takes out that bit. But I think Eve is very knowledgeable about the MFA Boston unionizing efforts, which I'm sure she'll add more in the chat on that. But I think it's a really important step, and it's really important to help with advocating for equity, for safety and reporting any sort of violence or inequity or anything that you're feeling in your workplace and things like that. And it's a really wonderful model for advocacy. And I found it really supportive at MoMA. So.
Yeah, no, I think that that's a really important point. And, you know, something that maybe we weren't thinking about so much, or maybe I wasn't thinking about so much before COVID, but, you know, like in the wake of this pandemic, I think that that idea of what's permanent, people being on contract for 10 years, really all of a sudden was thrown into question. And I think these recent unionizing efforts at various museums I think that's an important thing for us to consider, because it really does change, you know, the way you live your life. Do you buy a home? Do you what can you do if you're living in a city for 10 years on a permanent year-to-year contract? So
I'll also say I was at NYU when the graduate students also unionized while I was there. And it was great because our pay increased for being course assistants. So we all got a big pay increase with that as well. And so that was also a really positive union experience for conservators.
That's great. That's great. All right. Well, if no one has anything else, then I'm just going to keep going. So many ECPs fear that the level of education and the financial burden is going up, but the salaries remain the same. ECPs are concerned that the rising number of PhDs could potentially change the field in terms of devaluing the master's degree and exacerbating issues of access, equality, and inclusion. So Sanchita, I'm going to start with you this time. As someone who's currently working on a PhD, and Anisha, as someone who's recently decided to pursue a PhD, do you think that PhDs will become the new baseline standard in the field the way the master's degree has? Will salaries increase in order to be commensurate with the level of education required? And how will this affect the percentage of conservators, or how will this affect the perception of conservators' qualifications and ultimately access to higher levels in the museum world?
Yeah, so so I work in a university museum, so it's kind of a different setting than, you know, the Met or MoMA or any of these other institutions we've been talking about. And so being within an academic institution means the basic degree, basic qualification often is the PhD. A lot of what I've found, having now been in this academic context for some time now, is that you simply don't have a voice if you don't have a PhD. It's very frustrating. It doesn't matter how good your research is, you're just not invited. And in some cases you can't apply for grants. That luckily has not been the case for me. I've had a really incredibly supportive director. But a lot of people I know who have our kinds of professional qualifications, even if they are the terminal degrees in our fields, are not allowed to do anything outside of their kind of narrowly defined staff positions. And again, I'm very lucky in that my position was defined really broadly, and I have a lot of support to do much, you know, more collaborative, research-oriented things than a lot of people with the same type of title. So that was the first thing that was really kind of driving me and really frustrated me. But the second, I think the PhD is not something to do to get just the qualification. This is my third time in graduate school. I can tell you a very pathetic story from the last time I attempted to start a PhD program, but that's for, you know, a time when we don't need to go there. But really this time I went back to graduate school because I have some burning questions, intellectual questions that I need to spend time answering. And it is incredibly exhausting to do a PhD under any circumstances. I have a full-time job, I have a family, I have other things I want to do with my life. I'm not my work, but I also had this burning desire to spend some time answering these questions. And I have to say the current program that I'm in, the University of Delaware, has been amazing, where they understand me as a full human being. And it's also wonderful to be able to go in and not ask for funding. And that's an incredibly privileged position because I have a full-time job and I don't need them to support me financially other than pay for my tuition, which already, of course, is huge. So I came to it with a very different perspective. Now, what is that going to do in terms of my peers and colleagues? I'm just not, that's not what I'm going for. And frankly, the kinds of jobs that I was looking at as a practicing conservator are very different than the kinds of jobs that I might aspire to with this degree. I mean, essentially what I want to do at some point is to just be quiet in this room and write books. That's what I want to do. I don't want to, you know, look for more conservation treatment jobs, but I also want to be able to advocate for all of us and say, we are, you know, intellectuals, we are innovators, we are incredible collaborators, and we need more funding to do the amazing work we can do. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. The other thing I want to just mention, and it's in the download sheets, but I wrote up a sheet for current graduate students, because this is not just a problem for conservation, but now that I'm in, again, this academic context, I see all of the graduate students, you know, in various departments at my institution, and I interact with a lot of them, especially in classics and cultural heritage. And we're all dealing with these same problems, right? Where graduate school is set up in really harmful ways. Academic institutions and a lot of these larger institutions are set up in really harmful hierarchical ways, and that all needs to change. But in the meanwhile, what are ways that we can support ourselves? What are ways that we can just remember that our work is valid, but we also have to have a life? These are things that I really find myself advocating for, especially with the graduate students I encounter, because they are demoralized. I mean, this work is really hard no matter where you are, no matter how comfortable you might be. And it's all that much harder if you're dealing with all of these systemic forms of violence that exist in our world, right? So to me, it's really about how can we do the work we love. I mean, I do this PhD because I love it. No one can stop me from doing this because I love it. But I also want other people to have the things that they need so that they can pursue their best work that they love. So I'll put that in the chat as well. So.
Well, I can add to that a little bit as a incoming PhD. I was going to say current, but not quite there. I think it's similar to my reasons for doing a PhD were purely personal. They really similarly were not because I thought it was going to get me a leg up in any sort of conservation job. I do think it opens up things like academic positions, though those are highly sought after positions. Academia is not a path that really opens up in a way that is feasible. So though that is an option, it's not for me a reason to do a PhD. It really has been just a very sort of intimate relationship with my work and wanting to have the time and space to devote to it. And the fact that it's funded is the reason that I can pursue it, as well as like its location. The PhD stipend is not enough to live in a major metropolitan area, I would think. So you know, those are kind of the logistics of it. And I will say, like, I pursued that with that financial aspect of it completely in mind as well. I think there was a question from Michelle Ficini asking about if our paths, if our degrees, master's degrees are really only a master's, you know, do they kind of, or is it on its way to a PhD? And that's interesting. I bring that up because as I was getting my master's degree, my husband was getting his PhD, and it felt very much like, you know, a super master's degree or a mini PhD. You know, our paths were so similar, just had some fewer expectations and some, you know, fewer years. And so I think that's something to think about in a world where, or at least in the US, where we're getting increasing degrees. You know, a high school degree means something different than it used to. A bachelor's degree means something different. So I do think that's like an interesting thing to think about if your master's was like an on-ramp to the PhD, which I think at Delaware in some ways it is. You don't do the same amount of coursework because you're expected to come in with a master's degree. So I think it's great to be bringing these ideas up now, because I can imagine it would be a lot of work to sort of reconfigure how these programs are. But I do think it's something to think, again, if we're talking about valuing the work we do, thinking about how intense our master's programs are, and thinking about what the value of our degrees are is really important. And I think that there was a part of this about salary, and like it's hard to imagine a lot of scenarios where our jobs are going to get increasingly like paid so much better because you're coming in with a PhD. I hope so, but I'm not sure. Yeah, Shiva.
I just want to quickly follow up on that, on the salary question. So within my institution, I make more money than some people who have PhDs because of how exploitative higher education and who teaches, you know, and how their contracts are set up to teach are. So following up on that unionizing conversation that was happening earlier, what I found is that, you know, it's really important to find allies in whatever way you can. So I end up with all of the other instructors, the people who have contracts and are not tenure track, because we do similar work and our pay grades are all over the place. And we're often seen as very different in terms of our value to the institution, as opposed to, you know, these tenure track people. So a PhD might not necessarily mean anything at all in terms of a salary, just to reiterate that.
I see the ground. I have nothing else.
I'm going to go with Chris and then Glenn.
Just a small thing, thinking about like standards and PhDs becoming the new masters, that gives me a lot of anxiety. Being in a graduate school, there's nothing that is a standard except that I get a graduate degree at the end of it. It doesn't feel to me like my peers are learning the same thing as me. It feels very tailored to what I want it to be. And that doesn't, like, I'm wondering, what is the standard of the graduate school degree other than that we're getting a graduate school degree? So that makes me want to back up and instead think about what does a graduate school degree get you? should this be the standard? What does that standard mean? So, before we even get to, is PhD going to be this new standard? What is the standard of a graduate school degree, and why have we created that? That's where I'll leave it. Glenn.
Well, I wasn't going to address that. I could, but I was going to go back to what Anisha and Sanchita were saying about the PhD. I, like them, decided to pursue a PhD in my mid-career because I was forced with the situation that I could not even get out of my mind. These people in Hawaii who wanted to take care of their sculpture, and the state telling me that no, I had to go in and gold leaf it when they were painting it. And I realized that there was something really wrong with our profession and really lacking in my own skill set and knowledge. And I just had to do this. I had to just stop everything in life and pursue this and learn what ethnography was, learn how public artists work with communities, and how one can empower communities through engagement in narrating how their own past is told through this conservation effort. So I was driven to do this. I did not enter a PhD program that was paid. Fortunately, I'd been running a private practice for, I think, 12 years at that point. And so I was able to keep doing private practice on the side while I was, being a PhD student. So that's how I made it financially. But in terms of, I'd just like to say several other things really quickly. I think pursuing a PhD prepares you to do something very different in life. And I don't think most people with PhDs are going to be competing for museum jobs as conservators. I actually did get a job at MoMA. I was very surprised about that. I didn't think any museum would hire me with a PhD. I thought I would be either working with an NGO or maybe in a university. As it turned out, I worked in museum studies at NYU for 16 years, but I was never on tenure track. So it was a full-time job, but it was a sort of a lower class professorial position. As Sanchita mentioned, there's lots of different sort of scales and ways to be an academic. It wasn't until I was 65 that I accepted a tenure track. I was given tenure, but accepted a position within that system. So yeah, I think this is a very complex question about PhDs in our field. Let me just say one more thing. As I was negotiating my job at UCLA, the dean promised me 2 new faculty members so we can expand our program. That's been put on hold because of COVID, but hopefully that will come up soon. But he told me we're not hiring anybody without a PhD and for a tenure track position. And the reason why is the university culture, as Sanchita mentioned, so much centers around having a PhD, that a conservation graduate program at a research university without faculty with PhDs is going to be looked at as a sort of a vocational program and really devalued within the university system. So I'm not arguing, that all conservation professors should have PhDs, not at all, but I'm just saying from the university perspective, there's some really good arguments because of the university culture. So I'll leave it at that.
I think what's also really interesting about the PhD system is that in the US anyway, that it's theoretically based, that it's a theory-based pursuit of study and not a hands-on pursuit of study. And thinking about how the distinction in Europe for PhDs, I would love to hear more, Glenn, if you want to speak back to that again, but to think about can we learn from Europe and how they've integrated PhDs? I think what's interesting about, there's a fear for I think Chris and I both kind of oh God, to go back to grad school, but there's a fear that we might have to go back to get a PhD, but I don't think that that's actually the case. I think that we can expand our field to find position and space for all of this. And I think what I love about the European conservation community is how much space there is for theory. I have especially in contemporary art conservation, my mind has been blown by the theoretical pursuit in Europe. And I think that's driven by a broader base of PhD candidates. And I think that if we can move away from having kind of this scarcity fear-based model that somehow the PhDs are going to get all our jobs, that it's okay for them to find space within our conservation community in the US to, I think, for a greater expansion and for a greater thought on our field. I mean, like the things that Anisha is going to be studying in her PhD program are going to be huge for us, and I think it's really important that you're doing this work. And I think it's going to have a big impact on our field. So it's kind of interesting to make sure that we're not cornering it into that, to scarcity, and that can be really expansive, I think.
Yeah, Sanchita.
So one piece of advice I got when I was looking at PhD programs, and, again, this is my second time starting a PhD program. So I really, 10 years of thinking about this. So it wasn't like I just decided to do it. So you need to think about it. But the best piece of advice I got about the PhD is thinking about who you want to be in conversation with. And for me, there were certain things that were really bothering me about the way ancient studies is written. And, and that's because I engage with that material as a conservator with the collection that I work on. And there were so many ways in which so many people's contributions and the diversity of the ancient world was completely ignored. And my PhD is actually a combination of theory and very applied, RTI work and experimental work. So I think it's very possible. But my decision actually was based on who I wanted to be in conversation with. And for me, that was to disrupt the existing scholarship in this particular place. So you can see already, this does not have anything to do with like taking the jobs of other conservators. And I think we really need to, kind of break out of that, because that is another kind of fear mongering that we don't really need to, further.
All right, great. Thank you all so much. I think there's a lot happening in the chat, and if we have time, I'm gonna try and come back to that after the questions that we got. But for now, I wanna start our last topic as we are, coming sort of to the end of our session. And I wanna really drill down on salary. We've talked about it in a number of ways through a couple different lenses. And we've had this conversation in our field a number of times. We know that conservation is a female-dominated field, and we know that women are paid around 1/3 of what their male counterparts. Suzanne Davis has published on this. ECPN has had a webinar on this, and yet the issue remains. So I think the new angle on this conversation is that in the wake of COVID-19 and the economic turndown, ECPs are really beginning to push back on low salaries in general, as we've heard a number of times today. And so I'm going to again reference the 2018 compensation survey, which found that only 50% of the respondents from postgraduate demographic indicated that they were able to live independently and fulfill basic needs through conservation employment. We often hear that the rationale for keeping salaries low is so that more positions can be created. But many have responded to that argument by stating that the continued creation of low-paying jobs, even in potentially greater numbers, ensures that the jobs are only accessible to the same demographic of people who currently occupy them, which tend to be middle to upper class white women or those who can afford to take such low-paying positions. So my last question to all of you is, how can we claim to be working towards a more equitable and diverse field without first addressing the low salary issue?
Joy, I don't know if you were planning, you unmuted, but I'll just, there's so much to say about that. I mean, 100%, we have to address salaries. And I think a small step is posting salaries, not knowing what a salary is, going through all of the work, sometimes paying for your way to an interview site. All of that, which is also not equitable and should not be happening, but certainly is happening. I think the field has even been resistant to those small steps of saying, let us require salaries be part of our job postings. I'm incredibly grateful to all of the people who mostly early career professionals who put their name out there and say, can you please repost this with a salary? I mean, that should not be the system. That should not be like us hoping that someone's paying enough attention in their free time to do that. I don't want to get caught up in just salary postings, but I think it's just in the Equity and Inclusion Committee, that was one of the first things we tried to do because we saw it as low-hanging fruit. And here we are, like years later, still not having solved that issue because we got so much resistance from a technological standpoint, from just people disagreeing with the logic that, HR managers do not want to post salaries. So I will just say that I think that we need to be, for us to be able to raise the salaries, we need to be pushing at every single angle that we have access to, from both a hiring position and if you're a job seeker. And it's certainly much more vulnerable if you are the job seeker. And so for those of us who are on the hiring side, the more we can do to push the numbers and to push the culture, the bigger impact we'll have. And I will just say that, like, we hear so often, I guess people are not recognizing that this can be good for everyone. I mean, if you raise up the people at the bottom, you raise up the whole field. If the people coming in are more transparent, you know how much they're getting paid. If they're getting paid as much as you and you've been there for 5 years, like that's an opportunity to do something. Those are hard numbers. So we definitely need to be talking more and more about money. I'm happy we're talking about it now in the past few years, but we need to be talking about it even more. And it comes down to the kind of culture we've created, of feeling lucky to get a $1 paying job because yesterday we were getting paid $0. I mean, just all of it is not okay. And so the more we talk about it, the better. But again, like I really urge everyone to whatever seat at whatever table you have to be really pushing this issue, because that's the only way it's going to happen.
Yeah, to follow up on Anisha, I think the more and more we all talk about it, I find that among my colleagues and my colleagues in conservation, we talk a lot about salary, and people will call and be like, I just got offered this. How much is that? Did you get offered how much did you get for your moving stipend? Did you get that there? And like, there's a lot of back end side of things, and it helps you push forward. I will say I also, when I was negotiating my salary, I sent my response first to one of my other sponsors, I guess, another chief conservator at a different museum that I really trusted. And I was like, is this an okay response to ask for more money? And it was great. They gave me a really great insight into the response, the email response, because they want the pay to also increase. But there's pressure from HR to make sure that that's the initial offer is what it is, but you can always come back and ask for more. But I think I'm really cognizant of the fact that all of us are coming to this out of museum institutional orientation, and that the field in private practice is quite different, and that pay is often higher in private practice. And also bench work and a lot more conservation treatment is happening in private practice now, so it's interesting to see how the shift in actual conservation work is happening a lot more outside the museum. And I think actually once we find a better way for private practice to be able to be more transparent in how much people are making, that I think it's going to really raise up more salaries in the museum. Because if you think about how much we're paying for a contract for one artwork to get restored by a private conservator, because we don't have time in the museum, that helps increase our just kind of that general awareness of like, there's a lot of money in art. No one said art's a broke field. It's not. There's a ton of money. So it's just figuring out where that money is and negotiating a bigger pie for conservation. And there is one, because it's happening in private practice. So until we can kind of institutionalize that notion, that's where we can actually, I think that we'll be able to see a lot more transparency in breaking that open. Yeah.
I think that's a great point about private practice, and something that, we don't talk about necessarily as much as we should. But I think is a big part of this. And I actually really liked how you tied it into the fact that, oftentimes museums are partnering with contract conservators, and the pay is different there, and it's recognized there. And so it's not that it's unknown to those in the museum world, it's just looked at very differently. And I think that that's a great idea as a place to start. Yeah, Glenn.
I just want to say, having run a private practice for 16 years, private practices vary a lot in conservation, and conservators who work on contemporary art in New York are probably making a lot of money, but conservators who are working on archaeological, indigenous materials, textiles, and in rural areas are really struggling. It's a very different economy. So just want to say that it really varies a lot. And sometimes museums conservators with benefits and secure salaries don't understand the struggles that some private conservators or many private conservators have.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's really important insight to have too. And I appreciate you pulling from your experience in private practice. Yeah, Sanchita.
So just following up on what Glenn said, I mean, not only does revenue from private practice vary from region to region and specialty to specialty, but year to year. I mean, some years I had, extraordinary, well, within reason, like significantly more money than other years. And often you're just like hoarding as much work as you can, probably taking on too much and freaking yourself out in order to sort of save, because the next year might be a COVID year, right? But that being said, when I was up for this job at Hopkins, the reason why I could negotiate a higher salary than they were going to offer me is because I could show them my tax return from the previous year where I had 2 federal government contracts. And I was like, I'm not taking your crappy job. And they said, well, what would you need in order for this to work out? I mean, luckily they wanted to hire me, which is always a good thing. And I could negotiate other things. Like I wanted to have summers flexible so that I could continue doing field work and continue doing research. So we should also think about other things that could make you happy, that can help with, your sustainable lifestyle, however you define that. So that's one thing. Another thing I want to point out is there are a lot of us in comfortable positions who continue to suggest to people that they volunteer or they give up their labor for free or very little pay. We need to stop that. We need to absolutely stop that and say, and I'm not willing to volunteer my time. Don't set that as the standard, right? Because it really harms all of these other people who are not in a position to say, I can't take it without compensation. So we need to value our time and value the time of all these people that we claim to want to support and uplift. And then I think the one other thing in terms of where are all the jobs, right? This is kind of the problem of our field in some ways. I think part of the reason why we don't have jobs is because we are looking to the same set of institutions and under, the same sort of poorly set up institutions to provide this kind of bounty of jobs. Cultural heritage is something that people feel in their hearts and their souls. Like this is, people need this to live. And I think COVID has really shown that. This is what allows people to kind of continue on in times of incredible turmoil and heartbreak. I mean, you just have to open the newspaper today and there's so much going on and yet people are surviving because they're tied to their heritage, right? We should be able to actually expand our understandings of what kind of work we can do because there's money in everything that actually supports things that are life-giving to people. So I think it's up to us to really expand the ways in which we can interface with all of these other industries, all of these other ways in which people are working and really provide service, right? Instead of being at the service of curators, a lot of us, I think, are frustrated by being in that kind of service position. What would it be like to be in service to communities broadly defined who really want us to work with them, want our help, and therefore be able to get different forms of funding? I think that is the challenge and the money is out there. We just need to kind of change the way that we're thinking about what success means.
I see a lot of nodding heads, and I think a lot of us agree and appreciate hearing that, changing what success means. Okay, so with that, I'm going to switch over to the Q&A, and I know that there's been a lot happening in the chat. I haven't been able to keep up with the chat as much, so if you've posted a question in the chat and you want me to pose it to the panelists, if you'll look at your little toolbar, there's a Q&A section. So I'm gonna read from those first. So starting at the top, Can you give advice/thoughts on what happens when you try to negotiate and fail, when there aren't many jobs/fellowships available after graduation, and when these opportunities are exciting? Is the side hustle the only way forward? How do we put pressure on the institutions that offer unlivable circumstances?
I can start with that. Yeah, so that's a really great question. And I think that's always the fear, is you're going to negotiate and not get what you want. I think there's a few options depending on the situation you're in. I would say the first is that you can, like some people are brought up, you can negotiate things that are not money. If those are things important to you, you want to be negotiating the salary, and salary and benefits are separate. But if it's something you really want and there's other ways to get to where you need to go, there's ways to negotiate maybe a different schedule, like working 4 days a week or working shortened days to do other things that might bring you value in your life or help you save money or make money in a different way. I do not think the side hustle is the only way forward. I think having fallback plans and plan Bs and things like that is great, but I think we shouldn't perpetuate the idea that conservation can only be a part-time job because of how much it pays. So I would think about, like, are there other ways that you can do what you want to do, like days for teaching, days for research, whatever that might be, and then like negotiating the other benefits like health insurance and other things. There was like a second part to that question, so I'm just going to bring it up. Sorry. But how do we put pressure on institutions? Yeah, well, there's, I think that telling institutions the reality of what they're offering you can, first of all, be part of your negotiation. If they're paying you so little that you can't live there, and you're living under the poverty line, you're using the MIT living wage calculator, like if that's a situation you're in, that's a negotiation tactic. I mean, you need to bring that up and tell them that. And those numbers can be really eye-opening. These are people with humanity. They want you to be able to not live on food stamps. And I think bringing all of that up to them, some people are very clueless about rent. They have bought a house 30 years ago. They do not know you're paying $2,000 in rent and what the cost of public transportation is and how much milk is at the grocery store, right? Like they're living in a Whole Foods world and maybe you're living at like the Aldi world, whatever. So I think really like putting down the numbers in your negotiation. I put down how much it's going to cost me to move. And I don't just put down, a budget line. I put down the hotel, the car, the truck, whatever, because these are not people that might understand these things. So again, that's negotiation tactics. That's not the same. But if you're turning down a position, and this is all up to your comfort, but if you're having to turn down a position because you can't live on what they're telling you, what they're giving you, saying that and being clear about that, if you feel comfortable doing that, can go a long way in helping them increase, taking that to the people who control the purse strings and trying to increase the stipends. And I know students have been successful with that, but you're totally going out on a limb. If you don't feel like you can do that, maybe you have like a mentor or advisor who can step in and help you through that process. So you're not just someone who turned down a job because you're not getting paid enough, right? But I do think kind of mapping out the numbers can show them that you really, really want to take this job. You just want them to meet you at a place that you can take it. So I say reach out to the people in your network, or reach out to anyone on this panel if you don't feel comfortable with your network to help you through this. You don't need to do this alone.
Great. Okay. Chris applauded, so I think we'll move on. I think everyone agrees. If given the opportunity to change any element of the conservation career path, post-secondary, emerging jobs, established career, what would that look like or feel like? Are there any elements that we can take from career paths in other countries or professional fields, apprenticeships already mentioned, tool shares, rentable lab spaces, or support for moving fees? I see that Sanchita said all.
That's a stumper. I'm not sure how to answer that, but maybe I'll just say something sort of along the same lines that Sanchita mentioned, that I think we do need to rethink what conservators can do in the world. And we do need to look, yes, at other fields and see how they're developing and broadening, and look at how the kinds of skills and knowledge that we have can be applied more broadly in cultural heritage management, for instance. But there's a number of fields close to ours that could use conservation skills and knowledge. Everything from the insurance industry to law to cultural heritage management. And I think that, and well, in art history, technical art history, archaeology, the same thing, that they really value the material understanding that conservators have. So I think one possibility in the future is that conservators will be adding new tools to their repertoire in order to work in adjacent fields and be really valued for what they can contribute.
Thanks, Gwen. That was actually really nice to hear. I know, as Sanchita said, I'm one of the people who has often thought, what else am I qualified for? And insurance didn't cross my mind. And when you said it, I was like, oh, wait, that could be kind of interesting. So
that was totally one of my side hustle plans in grad school, is I wanted to become an insurance agent, that I could sell insurance to all the conservators who were doing private practice in their apartments. And I was like, this is it. I got it. But I think on top of that, I think, and it kind of from the previous question too, is I keep coming back to kind of crowdsourcing. I think a lot of what we can move forward and how we can push the envelope forward and a lot of stuff is tool shares, rentable lab spaces, like things like that are joining, but also, you know, everyone on this call, if there is a post on the dis list that doesn't have the salary, let's have everyone reply and ask for what the salary is. You know, there's 114 of us on this. So that would be amazing. But if you think about like this crowdsourcing and what we can do and the pressure that we can build, I think is quite amazing. And I've seen, I have a colleague and she just joined a company, installation and shipping company as their conservator, because they were just working together all the time. And it made more sense for the conservator to work with the shipping company than to just constantly be signing contracts with each other. And so I think that there's a lot of creativity in where we can move forward. That a conservator doesn't have to be a conservator. A conservator might just be a qualification for many other things. You know, I like to look to Jill Starrett a lot and think about how she became, you know, an upper management in the museum model, and she wasn't working on anything in her lab, or like at Pip Lawrenson or things like that, and what they're doing within the institutional structure. I think it's kind of like, I don't know, moving momentum.
Great. I'm going to keep moving so that we can try and get through as many of these as we can. So do our paths really only equal a master's degree in conservation? What about counting these experiences towards an accelerated doctorate degree? If our field encouraged/provided easier access to doctorate degrees, then conservators could have more options to enter allied fields or teaching.
I might just jump in and say there are many different types of doctorate degrees, and particularly in other countries, there are doctorates of practice where you can actually do research, but use case studies that you've done in the past, conservation projects and write-ups, articles that you've published. It's not so easy in this country, but in the UK and Australia and other countries, there are ways to get PhDs based on research and practice that you've already done. So people interested in that may want to look into it.
Great. So Next question. Everyone has touched on this in some way or another, but can you talk about your work-life balance? How can the conservation field in grad school, fellowships, full-time jobs support and encourage a healthy work-life balance?
I can't talk about my work-life balance.
That's okay. It looks like Chris has the answer.
I don't think I have the answer, but I am currently in the middle of finals week, so I feel like I should say something. I have been advocating for my own personal boundaries in all of my professional settings. I'm not very good at it. I'm learning. It's been a long way here. I also have, I've been lucky enough to have supervisors who are like, you need to have boundaries. I think finding what you need and then establishing boundaries is the way to do it. And if someone doesn't respect those boundaries, finding an advocate who can help you communicate those boundaries.
Yeah, I would say if you're in a position where, you know, you're not a student, so you advocate for your boundaries and you're not getting them like at an institution, then I think you have to rethink being at that institution. Like, I think those boundaries need to be really, like in a long-term situation, really need to be enforced by you. And I do things like even like writing down like non-negotiable things in my life. Like, you know, I will not tolerate X, Y, and Z. And I kind of find that going through this thought process for myself helpful, because when the situation arises, I don't find myself crumbling to the pressure of just giving in to things. Because I thought about it ahead of time, you know, without the specific situation. And, you know, finding that support network that kind of helps you enforce those things and sort of checks in. And, you know, when you're venting to them, says, wait, is that okay? Like, should we just be venting about this, or should we be doing something about this? You know, enforcing your boundaries is like a whole other aspect of that. But I think that's definitely my tactic too.
I really like that idea, Anisha. I think that's great practical advice. Just writing down ahead of time so there's no question when it comes up. Okay, so I'm going to quickly address this. Can Jessica expand on the comment that some places are not counting fellowship years as years experience when hiring for staff positions? That's astonishing and so disheartening. And I just want to say that I completely agree, and that this is information that's been reported to ECPN from various ECPs, that this is something, I don't know that it's new, but it's something recently that we've found out and has come, I think, through our compensation survey from 2018. And if you'll stick around for the poster session right after this, Caitlin Richardson is going to present that information. So that's all I can really say about that. I don't know if any of the rest of you have heard about this, or some of you are shaking your head or want to comment or just look at me in fear, Chris, then otherwise I'm going to move on because I like the next question. Based on Anisha's response to a previous question, how can we calculate our value to an institution above the minimum/living wage? It seems like someone with a master's degree should be getting more than just that. Sanjita.
Zoom etiquette. The one thing that I think has been really helpful is to always keep in mind what the mission of the organization that you're working for is, and always think about how whatever project you're proposing, whatever work you're planning to do really fits with that mission. Because I think a lot of the pushback that I've seen that comes is when you're trying to do something that doesn't seem to align with what the institution claims it cares about. And it goes back to what Glenn was saying, like, what are the values, the stated values of that institution or whatever it is. And if you can think about ways in which the project or whatever you want to innovate, you know, I think I'm always in favor of coming up with something that people have never seen before, that fits with the mission, that also fits with your deepest desire, right? Like, what do you want to contribute? And it's really extraordinary. If you can frame it in that way, there are a lot of things that can happen. Of course, you need a supportive, supervisor, someone else who can kind of go with you on that. But even if you don't have a supportive supervisor, I think even just being able to articulate what you care about relative to the institution or whatever situation you're in, at least makes you feel like you're doing something that you care about. And in some ways, that's the most important thing, I think.
I think that that's a great place to end, and some great advice. So if no one has anything else to say, I think I just want to thank all of you so much for agreeing to be on this panel. I think this has been a really, really wonderful conversation. I know that I've learned a lot, and I really appreciate the insight from all of your different experiences. There's a lot happening in the chat, so I think that a lot of people have taken away some good information for this. So I'm just going to say that now we're going to pause, and then we have two really great posters that are going to be presented. And then following our poster session, we have our annual ECPN Town Hall information session. So if you can, stick with us. Otherwise, thank you all for attending, and especially thank you again to our panelists. This has been really wonderful. Hi, everyone. If you're just tuning in, this is now the ECPN Poster Session. We've got two really great posters today, and I'm just going to take a minute and introduce our authors. Well, I'm going to introduce them and then allow them to introduce themselves. Let's start with Caitlin Richardson. Caitlin, if you just want to tell us a little bit about yourself, and then I'll turn it over to Ashley and Michaela, and then we can get into the posters.
Sure, thanks, Jess. My name is Caitlin Richardson. I'm the current and outgoing chair of ECPN, and I am currently an assistant conservator at the American Museum of Natural History. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and bring up the poster. So out of respect for time, I'm going to be going kind of fast because I'm going to be throwing out a lot of facts and figures at you. But rest assured, the last slide is going to include both a link to the single poster page and these slides as a PDF. So today I'm going to be presenting some of the key takeaways from the 2018 ECPN compensation survey. And I want to specifically preface that these are only a few of the takeaways from a very comprehensive survey, which will hopefully soon be released after ECPN submits it for approval by the AIC board. I also want to acknowledge that the bulk of this work was accomplished by the officers who came before me, namely Eve Mayberger, Kari Reiner, Kat Fanning, and Quinn Harris, as well as the soon-to-be chair, Jessica Betts-Abel, and myself, who've been working to finish the long form report. So as a quick introduction, the survey was targeted. I'm going to turn my camera off because it's going a little slow. Sorry. The survey was targeted for individuals who are citizens and or residents of the United States, currently employed in the United States, or attending graduate school for conservation in the United States. At least 383 individuals accessed the survey form. 369 responses were recorded for the first question, and 16 respondents were instructed to exit the survey based on the selections to the first question, which was, are you a citizen of the United States, or are you attending graduate school within the United States? While it's not possible to determine a definitive response rate, various figures can be used to estimate the level of engagement. So our response rate was approximately 20.7%, or 311 out of 1,500, which was calculated among members of AIC. And so this survey came about in relation to the 2014 FAIC and AIC compensation survey. So in 2014, this document was created. AIC and FAIC conducted a general compensation survey, which included extensive analytics that are helpful for understanding compensation levels across specializations, geographic regions, employment settings, and years of professional experience. The AIC FAIC report includes the median salary for professionals based on years of experience in the field, grouping the data into 5-year periods. However, the data is analyzed in relation to the position titles, such as fellow, contract, project conservator, or assistant conservator. So ECPN collected compensation data from published advertisements for postgraduate fellowships, positions to support this data, as well as our survey responses. So first, the demographics of our respondents. .60 respondents self-identified as female, while 7.12 responded self-identified as male, and 1.71 identified as non-binary or third gender. The age distribution was strongly concentrated between 21 to 40 years of age, with 91.73% of respondents indicating that their age fell within this range. Respondents were also given the option to identify with more than one ethnicity by checking all that applied. So each of these charts indicates the respondents by age, the respondents by career stage, and their self-identified ethnicity. 79.5% of the emerging conservators who responded to the survey self-identified as white or Caucasian, with the earlier career stages appearing to be slightly more diverse. The second most prevalent group overall is Asian, followed by Hispanic and white, and Hispanic or Latin American. Each of the, in addition to all of the comprehensive questions asked, the respondents, some of the survey was broken down into issues that affect the different demographic groups of emerging conservators, such as pre-program, graduate, and postgraduate respondents. Some of the key questions for pre-program respondents dealt with their education, how long they were employed, and the level of supervision they were given. Education, 78.96% of pre-program respondents indicated that they hold an undergraduate degree. 10.96% reported that they had a master's degree. 4.11% indicated that they had an associate's degree. and 6.85% indicated that they had a high school diploma. Pre-program respondents were asked to indicate the number of conservation jobs or volunteer titles that they held, including short-term positions, such as contracts, and the number of institutions in which they've worked. The greatest percentage of pre-program respondents have held 5 or more titles, 38.4%, and worked in 5 or more institutions prior to entering into grad school. Supervision was also something we specifically asked pre-program students about, as it was considered crucial among other forms of professional support to gauge the level of pre-program candidates. Overall, respondents were asked to agree or disagree with the statement, "I receive adequate supervision," on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being strongly agree and 5 being strongly disagree. As with pre-program respondents, some of the key questions geared towards the graduate respondents were concerning education level and their employment during the graduate program. When asked about their level of education, 68.2% of graduate level respondents indicated that they held a bachelor's degree, and 29.5% indicated that they had a master's degree while entering grad school. 69.77% of graduate student respondents indicated that they worked in a conservation-related role in the United States in the 2018 calendar year during their academic tenure, either during the academic year or over the summer. 11.63% indicated that they had not worked in the conservation-related role during the 2018 calendar year, while 18.6% indicated that they worked in a conservation-related position as a pre-program candidate prior to their enrollment in graduate school. Some of the key topics for postgraduates concerned employment and research ability at their current position. Respondents were asked for the number of conservation-related positions, job titles, including their current position and short-term positions, such as contracts they held, and the number of institutions they worked for since graduating their MA, MS in conservation. It was also considered critical to ask postgraduate respondents about their ability to conduct research at their current institution, as this is one of the reasons why fellowships, for instance, are often cited as giving less pay because you're giving more research time. So postgraduate respondents indicated that in at least one conservation-related position in 2018, that 53.46 indicated that they were able to research, while 46.56% indicated that they were not. Of those who did indicate that that their position involved research, respondents were also asked whether they are given the amount of time needed to pursue and research in these positions. 68.35% indicated yes, that they agreed with that. 28.78% responded no, and 2.88% responded that this was not applicable. In terms of titles, pre-program, graduate, and postgraduate respondents were asked to give their position titles. The majority of pre-program respondents at 41% and 38% respectively were either technicians or pre-program interns. Graduate respondents were most commonly academic year interns or summer interns, and postgraduate respondents were most commonly conservation fellows at 23%, conservators at 20%, or assistant conservators at 18%. The next few slides are going to dig in a little bit deeper into employment and benefits and compensation. So termed positions, of the 383 respondents, 48.5% reported that their position was term limited. When asked if they knew whether or not their position could be extended, only 33 respondents were confident in this possibility, while 62 were unable to extend and 64 did not know if this was even a possibility. In terms of the hours worked, few pre-program respondents were considered full-time employees or those who worked 40 hours a week. 40% of pre-program respondents were not considered full-time and worked between 5 to 36 hours per week on average. The majority of graduate and postgraduate respondents were considered full-time employees. 70% of graduate respondents reported working 31 to 45 hours per week, while 84% of postgraduates responded that they worked 31 to 51 and over hours per week. The postgraduate respondents were then further asked whether their agreed upon hours of work per week actually reflected their actual hours worked. Although 68% of postgraduate respondents thought their hours of work were accurate, 26% thought that they worked more. In terms of employment and unemployment, the majority of survey respondents were employed in conservation-related capacities in 2018. However, some respondents reported periods of unemployment. On average, pre-program respondents spent 2 to 6 months unemployed, while postgraduate respondents spent 3 to 12 plus months unemployed. In terms of compensation, overall 21.5% of respondents reported that they were compensated, while 8% of respondents specifically reported that they were not compensated. Of those who were not compensated, pre-program respondents made up the majority of that 8%. When asked to specify the source of their compensation, 18% reported that they were compensated directly by the employer, company, or institution where they worked, and 3.7% reported that they were externally funded by an outside organization, grant, or funder, such as a private endowment or the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation or Samuel H. Crest Foundation. Few respondents reported that their stipend, hourly wage, or salary increased slightly over time to account for inflation. Only 5% of respondents reported that their compensation was slightly increased annually, while 7.2% reported that there was no increase, and 5.5% were unsure. In terms of salary transparency, few respondents, only 27%, reported that a salary range was included in the job posting for the position they currently hold. When job postings advertised the salary range, most respondents, 11.5%, reported that their actual salary reflected the salary range publicly posted. In terms of negotiation, 16.5% of overall respondents reported that they did not attempt to negotiate their starting salary. Only 5% of respondents reported that they negotiated their compensation package. Of those who did attempt to negotiate, 4.6% reported that they were successful in their efforts, while 7.4% reported that they were unsuccessful in negotiations. The majority of respondents, 57.5% of overall respondents, were provided benefits from their place of work. Respondents were asked to rate their satisfaction with their current benefits. Of the respondents, 45.8% strongly agreed that they were satisfied with their current benefits, while 35.7% agreed, 12.3% neither agreed nor disagreed, and 5.7% disagreed, meaning that they were unsatisfied with their benefits. This is a fact that Jess mentioned earlier in the moderated panel, but a majority of graduate and postgraduate respondents, 62% and 60.5% respectively, reported that they were required to move for a position, while 28% of pre-program respondents reported the same. Despite the high requirement of relocation, few were given financial support to aid in the burden of relocating. Only 3% of pre-program, 21% of graduate, and 19% of postgraduate respondents were provided financial support for relocation. This is another key fact, supplemental income. Overall, the majority of respondents reported the need to supplement their income. Consistent among pre-program, graduate, and postgraduate respondents was the reliance on familial or partner financial support for non-conservation based jobs. These statistics uphold the long-standing belief that conservation is really only a realistic field for those who can afford to pursue it. In terms of financial security, this was specifically written into the survey to gauge the respondents' perception of their own financial security. Respondents were directed to indicate the degree to which they agreed or disagreed with the following statement. I am able, or it would be possible, to live independently and fulfill basic needs, such as the ability to pay for rent, bills, and food, with the total annual salary or stipend I received through compensation employment in 2018. So the respondents were able to indicate how much they agreed with this on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being strongly disagree and 5 being strongly agreed. Among the respondents, clear trends emerged for each of the emerging conservator demographics. Nearly half of those in pre-program indicated that they would be unable to live independently and fulfill basic needs through conservation employment. 41% of graduate students also selected this response, although a greater number indicated that they neither agree nor disagree. Approximately half of the respondents from the postgraduate demographic indicated that they either agree or strongly agree that they would be able to live independently and fulfill basic needs through conservation employment. Oh, sorry, I meant to move to this slide earlier. And here are the poster links. So the first one is the single poster page where all of the information is crammed onto one poster. And the second link is to the slides. And now I will pass it off to Ashley and Michaela.
Thank you so much for that, Caitlin. Let me go ahead, get mine up. All right, hi everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into the ECPN poster presentation. My name is Ashley Stanford. I'm one of the ECPN outreach co-officers along with Michaela Paulson. As outreach officers, we have the joy of overseeing the ECPN liaison program, which is what this poster is all about. This poster showcases the liaison program and highlights ways liaisons have collaborated, grown, served their communities, promoted awareness of the field this term, despite major obstacles to gather due to the pandemic. The ECPN Liaison Program began as a way to connect emerging conservation professionals in flora-front regions and has developed into a robust network with over 50 liaisons, facilitating conversation, support, community throughout the country. Through a short and painless application process coordinated with us, the outreach officers, liaisons are selected to be a part of one of 4 distinct programs: regional liaisons, graduate school liaisons, specialty group liaisons, and committee and network liaisons. Regional liaisons cultivate local networks of ECPs and foster a sense of community. They serve as ambassadors for ECPN within the larger conservation community and help to promote and distribute ECPN resources. Connecting with your regional liaison is a great way for ECPs at all stages, from pre-program to recent graduates and fellows, to connect with their peers. The ECPN graduate liaisons facilitate the flow of information about their particular graduate programs from their perspective to you, their fellow emerging conservators. Whether you're pre-program or a graduate of a different program or specialty, they're here to help. Prospective students are welcome to contact graduate liaisons with specific questions relating to student life and a student's perspective on the curriculum. The Graduate Liaison Highlight Series, which was started by ECPN outreach officers this term in 2020, interviews one graduate liaison each month to get more of a student's insight into the grad program and projects, the application process for school, and other helpful tools and resources for ECPs. These interviews are available on the ECPN subsite in the liaison news page. Within all AIC specialty group, committee, and networks are ECPN liaisons who facilitate communication and advocate for the larger ECP community. These groups and networks can request liaison help on specific initiatives and are asked to present the ECPN update at the relevant business meetings. The specialty group liaisons are a great resource for early stage ECPs to learn more about the ins and outs of that particular area of study. This past year, Chris Kanasan, the textile specialty group liaison, and Madeline Mihan, conservator and private practice liaison, hosted virtual lab tours with their respective specialty groups. And also throughout the 2018 through 2020 terms, outreach officers completed the specialty group liaison highlight series, highlighting each liaison and their chosen specialty, which are also available on the ECPN subsite. 2020 saw the expansion of the regional liaison network to include 5 new cities: Indianapolis, Indiana, Providence, Rhode Island, Nashville, Tennessee, Dallas, Texas, and upstate New York, and also Puerto Rico. Currently, there are a total of 30 regional liaison positions, 6 of which have co-liaison teams. Going into the 2021 and 2022 term, we'll be looking for many new liaisons to fill many of these roles. Lots of regional liaisons are off to graduate school, which is very exciting. So we'll be posting a call for open positions on the ECPN Facebook page and online community, so stay tuned for that. Michaela and I would also love to highlight some of the wonderful virtual events and programming liaisons have hosted and planned this term. We ask regional liaisons to organize at least 2 local events as part of the position. And the liaison network was really one of the first to come up with some really creative ways to stay connected even through social distancing rules. On the poster here, you can see I have images of the Texas-wide Bob Ross Sip and Paint event, the lab tour of M Conservation Studio with SIP and LA regional liaisons, and also the meet and greet, Meet the Graduate Liaisons virtual event. Another awesome virtual connection opportunity includes the San Francisco Mentorship Program with local conservators and their area ECPs, organized by Claire Emma Smith and Laura Garcia Vedren, the San Francisco regional liaisons. The mentorship program was formed in response to COVID-19 lockdowns, and it was a way to help match pre-program students struggling to find opportunities with virtual mentors in the Bay Area. An interview with these 2 about their program can be found on the ECPN Liaison News page. And let me share this other one. In the images here, I have a few other events liaisons have hosted this term. Collaboration between liaisons exploded this year due to the virtual instead of physical locations of events. The Southeastern regional liaisons in Atlanta, Columbia, and Williamsburg hosted a joint portfolio night, as did the Boston Providence regions. Boston, Dallas, and Houston liaisons hosted a Texas-wide conservators and private practice panel that spoke with conservators in various stages of their career about the ins and outs of owning, operating, and working in private practice. Many groups have also hosted happy hours for ECPs across city and state lines to network and talk about their experiences within the field. Additionally, Veronica Mercado Oliveras, Paola Valentin Irizarry, and Mayuli Santisteban have been busy translating ECPN resources into Spanish and providing virtual events to connect Latino conservators with ECPN in their ongoing series, Latinos in Conservation, Journeys, Challenges, and Experiences. These virtual connections and collaborative events have provided opportunities this year for ECPs to connect with their peers and established conservators in oftentimes more relaxed environments. Outreach officers plan to continue offering the use of the ECPN Zoom Pro account so that liaisons can maintain these virtual opportunities. We encourage you to reach out to your local regional liaison to connect with your peers and learn more about the field. So thank you so much for your time today. Please let me know if you have any questions about the liaison program.
Great, thank you so much to all of our presenters in the poster session this afternoon.